Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership.
Episode 182, The Naturalist. Johann Wilhelm Theodor Ludwig von Blandowski was a Polish-born explorer, natural scientist, zoologist and artist who led a Victorian government expedition to the junction of the Murray and Darling rivers from 1856 to 1857. He published an illustrated encyclopaedia of Aboriginal life, including the early 19th-century portrait images of the Nyeri Nyeri people. Blandowski was one of a number of influential German-speaking residents who were intricately involved in imagining, knowing and shaping colonial Australia. Known in Australia as William, Blandowski was born in Gleiwitz, Upper Silesia, Kingdom of Prussia, which is now Gleiwitz, Poland, on the 21st of January 1822. He was the youngest of 13 children to Johann Felix von Blandowski, a Prussian lieutenant colonel of the Medical Corps, and Leopoldine Gottlieb von Wosk. His parents were members of the minor Polish aristocracy, using the Winoir coat of arms. The Blandowski family, well known since 1610, belonged to Silesian nobility, but later became Germanised, abandoning the Roman Catholic faith for Lutheran. As a member of the Polish nobility and the son of a high-ranking and highly decorated officer in the Prussian army, Blandowski's beginnings were auspicious. However, the large family, his father's early death and poor investments meant that the family was not well off. No doubt due to financial pressure, Blandowski left the gymnasium in Lorben, an academic preparatory school, without gaining his Abitur certificate, the entry qualification for university in the public service. On the 31st of August 1834, Blandowski entered the Royal Prussian Cadets at Chelmno. He subsequently studied as a mining apprentice at the Tarnowitz Mining School and he regularly attended lectures at Berlin University. As part of his experience in the mines, he worked as a hauler on the coalface and as a manager of a team of Polish workers. It was probably at this time that Blandowski learnt Polish in addition to his native German. He rose to assistant manager in this part of the Glonis Group coal mine at Königshoot, but as a consequence of some kind of misdemeanour, coupled with political unrest across Germany and through intemperate statements made to the directorate of the Silesian Mining Board, Blandowski was forced to resign his position early in 1848. He volunteered for service with the army during the Schleswig-Holstein War in March 1848, but his appointment as a lieutenant was not confirmed. After completing his army service, he tried unsuccessfully to obtain another appointment in the Prussian mining service, but was turned down. These setbacks were one of the motivations for him to emigrate to Australia in 1849, along with many other Germans. He departed Hamburg on board the Ocean on the 5th of May 1849 and arrived in Adelaide on the 14th of September. There are reports his passage was paid for by a patron, Karl Bernhard Maximilian Wiebel, a founding member of the Zoological Museum in Hamburg. However, others say that he was financed through an agreement to collect Australian specimens for Hamburg collectors, probably Joachim Steeds. He began exploring the area around Adelaide, and his sketches from this period include geological scenes, fossils, animals, Aboriginal people and their artefacts. Some are crudely executed on the spot, while others have been refined for further circulation. He sent back specimens and sketches to Hamburg and a collection of Australian plants to Steeds, which was subsequently purchased by the Victorian government on behalf of the National Herbarium. Some of the important sketches that he did, and his first trip was between February and May 1850, where he travelled up the Murray River as far as Lake Bonny near Barmera and then down to Encounter Bay. In January 1851, Blandowski again travelled down the Murray to Wellington and Goolwa and then along the Coorong to the southeast, ending up at Robe on Goodsham Bay, and from there he went to Mount Gambier. His original object was to compile a natural history, a botanical classification and a geological arrangement of Australia. He also visited Sydney, Twofold Bay and Cape York by ship. Between February and June, he was employed surveying pastoral runs in the southeast. During this time, Blandowski also approached the Colonial Secretary, Charles Sturt, and the Governor of South Australia, Sir Henry Edward Fox Young, in unsuccessful attempts to gain official employment. Sometime after October 1851, when the Mount Alexander goldfield near Castlemaine was discovered, Blandowski and a small party of South Australian Germans tried their luck there prospecting. He made a fortune on the goldfields as he invented a double-action force pump to prevent mines being flooded. This success increased his profile and gained him the longed-for entree into the upper echelons of society. Blandowski worked in various localities until March 1853, when he sold his share of the claim and travelled to Melbourne to further his natural history aims. He arrived in Melbourne at an opportune time, when the gold-enriched colony was in the process of setting up various institutions and learned societies. His name appeared in the Melbourne Argus on the 4th of October 1852 as a foundation member of the short-lived Geological Society of Victoria, and he gave lectures at the Mechanics Institute. In 1853 he was briefly attached to the field party of the government geologist Alfred Selwyn. On the 21st of May, Blandowski asked Lieutenant Governor Charles Latrobe for an allowance to enable him to complete his illustrated natural history of the colony of Victoria. Impressed by further correspondence, Latrobe wrote to the Colonial Secretary on the 8th of November that immediate steps should be taken to open a museum and stated that Blandowski was the most suitable person to employ. Governor Latrobe invited Blandowski to submit his views on establishing a museum of natural history in Victoria, and in December 1853, at the invitation of Latrobe, he submitted a detailed memorandum of 6 pages on a museum of practical geology. Shortly afterwards, following representations by Mark Nicholson, member of the Victorian Legislative Council, the Colonial Secretary directed that a Museum of Natural History be established under the control of the Surveyor-General's Department. Blandowski was appointed curator on the 1st of April 1854, being formally employed as a surveyor in the Surveyor-General's Department. So it might rightly be claimed that Blandowski was the first government zoologist appointed in Victoria and the first employee of the Melbourne Museum. Blandowski enthusiastically took up his new duties, and he had the responsibility for early purchases of objects, specimens and books for the museum. On the 17th of June 1854, he was one of 8 men who founded the Philosophical Society of Victoria, which was a forerunner of the Royal Society of Victoria. He was appointed to its council, served for a short time in 1856 as an honorary secretary, and later became a life member. Between the 27th of June and the end of September 1854, he set out with 2 companions on a collecting expedition to Mount Macedon, Lancefield, Heathcote, Seymour and Euroa, and then back along the Sydney Road to Melbourne. His second trip, from November 1854 to February 1855, was to the Mornington Peninsula and Western Port, which covered Sandstone, Phillip and French Islands. Numerous specimens were collected, and there was an attempt to compile the first checklist of mammals and birds of Victoria. Blandowski had considerable knowledge of physical geography and geology, mineralogy, paleontology, zoology, ichthyology, botany and ethnology. His drawings were not only accurate in detail, but also had artistic merit. He described his findings in 7 reports that were published in the Transactions of the Philosophical Society of Victoria, 1855 to 1857. By early 1855, the museum could boast geological, paleontological and zoological specimens relating to more than 200 species, and his excursions proved valuable observations on the natural history of southern and central Victoria. Late in 1855, Blandowski learnt photography from a Melbourne photographer named Brown, and he and Brown went on a photographic excursion that included Mount Macedon and Kilmore. Blandowski exhibited the photographs from this expedition in the October 1855 meeting of the Philosophical Institute. Also during this period, Blandowski organised 2 exhibitions. The first was in October 1854, and this was of the Victorian materials that were destined for the 1855 Exposition Universelle in Paris. Blandowski showed geological and natural history specimens from the museum collections and received 1 of 2 silver medals awarded by the jury. Following his photographic excursion to Mount Macedon, Blandowski had his sketches, photographs and natural history specimens engraved by James Reddaway and Sons. These plates were exhibited at the 1856 exhibition of the Royal Victoria Industrial Society, for which Blandowski received a gold medal. The years 1855 to 1856 represented the high point of Blandowski's career. At 33 years old, as a museum curator, he had the opportunity to demonstrate his abilities as a scientist and artist. He was also an advocate for Aboriginal people and gave lectures on them to the Mechanics Institutes at Melbourne and suburban Prahran. However, his luck was not to last. The year 1855 was a period of government stringency in Victoria. Following the University of Melbourne's Professor of Natural Science Frederick McCoy's suggestion that the university would look after the museum collections free of charge, Governor Sir Charles Hotham ordered a relocation. In May 1856, Professor McCoy was appointed paleontologist to the Geological Survey Victoria. Despite the Philosophical Institute's spirited campaign of resistance, the collections were taken to the university at the end of July 1856. So not only did Blandowski become a curator without a collection, as far as the museum was concerned, McCoy became Blandowski's superior. McCoy was critical of Blandowski's lack of formal scientific training and was only willing to offer him a position as collector. Blandowski made attempts to have his position clarified. His life was considerably affected by Blandowski's life was considerably affected by this move. He opposed the transfer, and antagonism between the two men deepened beyond reconciliation. The Melbourne Argus on the 29th of July 1856 defended Blandowski, stressing his zeal and devotion to his work, and stated that the museum almost owes its existence to him. Blandowski presented Superstitions, Customs and Burials of the Aborigines, the first address of its kind, to the Melbourne Mechanics Institute in October 1856, arguing that the scientific value of the study of Aboriginal culture should not be ignored. He suggested to the Surveyor-General that he engage in a further scientific expedition. The Philosophical Institute, with £200 in government backing, initiated a scientific expedition to the Murray River with a view to collect specimens for the National Museum. The expedition was led by Blandowski, with Gerard Krefft as second in command. Blandowski received orders to proceed to the junction of the Darling and Murray Rivers for the purpose of making investigations on the natural history of that district and to collect as many specimens as possible, and marking the distribution of animal life along the route. This was Blandowski's fourth Victorian expedition, and it left Melbourne on the 6th of December 1856. They firstly travelled from Melbourne to Gunbower Creek on the Murray River, via Lancefield, the Campaspe River and Echuca, arriving at Gunbower Creek on the 28th of December. They camped at Gunbower until the 28th of February 1857, making side excursions to nearby Mount Hope and Pyramid Hill. In early March, they proceeded along the Murray to Hugh and Busby Jamieson's Mildura station via Lake Boga, Swan Hill, crossing the Murray briefly at Euston, before visiting the areas of Mildura, Yelta and Mondelamin, crossing briefly going into New South Wales at Wentworth at the Murrumbidgee Junction and Coolkine. The expedition then established their camp at Mondelamin, which is now called Chafee's Landing at Merbeen, on a slope looking directly onto the river. They stayed at Mondelamin from the 7th of April to the end of November 1857, and except for some side journeys made by Blandowski, the expedition stayed there for a total of 8 months. The Nyeri Nyeri people camped with the expedition, and Blandowski employed Aboriginal men, women and children as collectors and a succession of taxidermists to preserve the collections, while Gerard Krefft, second in command, managed the day-to-day business of the camp, cataloguing and illustrating the specimens. Blandowski made efforts to document the everyday activities of the Indigenous people, as well as dramatic conflicts and rituals, and he developed close relationships with those local Aboriginal people and was sympathetic to their situation. The zoological collections and illustrations and the observations of Aboriginal life are both rare and valuable for the fact that they were made at a time of significant ecological and social change. The expedition represented Blandowski's second chance. However, Blandowski's conduct indicates that unrealistically he seemed to see himself more as a heroic explorer than as a leader of a collecting expedition. As a result, he had trouble settling into his role. On the journey towards Mondelamin, he often left the party, stayed at public houses and home stations while the others camped out. Going between Gunbower Creek and Mondelamin, He rode on ahead, observing that when Krefft and Manson arrived 3 weeks later, they were in a most deplorable condition. While the party was at Mondelemin, Blandowski was absent for lengthy periods. He rode to Morindi in South Australia, which resulted in a 3-week absence in the April, and the Jamieson's Mount Murchison station on the Darling River, which is 3.5 weeks absence in the May. Also, while he was at Mondelemin, Blandowski approached the Victorian government, suggesting that the expedition leave the Murray and attempt to follow in Leichhardt's footsteps. Gerard Krefft was a young German, newly arrived from the US, and would later go on to be a contentious character as the curator of the Australian Museum. Gerard Krefft was tasked with many challenges during the 12-month expedition through Victoria. He had to learn how to deal with horses that didn't want to pull an overly filled dray. He had to endure the Australian sweltering heat and the bitter cold of camping. And he was at times the party's cook while completing his official role as an assistant to record and illustrate specimens collected on the journey. Writing up his experiences after the trip, a copy of Krefft's draft publication, the original is held by the Mitchell Library in Sydney, is fascinating to read. It is written full of emotion and subjectivity, a rare insight into a scientifically trained mind. He describes their journey as not an easy one, that it was marked with bad luck when on the eve of their departure their horse unexpectedly gave birth to a foal and was unable to be put to work. A few days into their journey, having scarcely travelled at all, their replacement horse decided to no longer lead the heavy dray of a 600 weight of books, a camera apparatus that never worked, and German vegetables used for emetic purposes, and it came to a complete halt in front of a Victorian public house. The locals in the vicinity of the pub offered a good deal of sympathy by beating the horse and attempted to set fire under its belly to make it move. Fortunately, the party purchased a pair of bullocks to pull the overstocked dray, and their rough journey began. Krefft was made the caretaker of the bullocks and horses. Krefft writes passionately about his experiences. He writes with great sarcasm and frustration when referring to the chief of the expedition, William Blandowski. He remarks on unnecessary requests made by Blandowski, such as unloading the full dray to retrieve his shirt that was packed at the bottom, making the men work on Sundays, and taking on untrustworthy companions. Gerard Krefft did not have the kindest words about his Indigenous partners who aided the expedition party in collecting natural history specimens. However, Krefft appears to have had a moment with his new companion, sharing a meal on the slopes of Mount Hope, which he poetically described. This moment had come, the hot embers were removed, the bottom of the hole laid out with fresh gum leaves. Then came the carcass of the bird, which was put into the hole, covered over with gum leaves and branches, on which were piled the pieces of clay which had been burnt to brick bars in the hot fire. Earth and hot ashes then covered every crevice, and the natives sat down round the oven ready. In about an hour's time the emu was done, and after being turned out of the skull it looked clean and wholesome enough. So I came in for my share too, and I enjoyed it very much, as the meat was well cooked and juicy, but rather coarse. It had the taste and appearance of beef, and never have been cooked quicker or better in a royal kitchen. Kreff's account gives a detailed picture of Australia during the 1850s and the amazing landscape through which he travelled. Blandowski continued to follow the Murray River to South Australia, and he established camps at Morindi and Goolwa and arrived in Adelaide in August 1857, before returning to Melbourne on the steamers Aubrey and Havilah with 28 boxes containing nearly 17,500 specimens, registered under 2,000 different numbers, and he travelled all up about 1,300 miles. Blandowski had to overcome many personal and physical setbacks, often created by his own faults, but he had accomplished his task. Krefft and Manson spent a further 4 months at Mondelemin. We do not know why Blandowski left the expedition early. However, he was able to take a considerable number of specimens and sketches back to Melbourne. Krefft returned to Melbourne at the end of November 1857, but never reported back to duty at the museum. Blandowski was employed by James Reddaway to create engravings of some of the drawings, and in Germany by Gustav Mutzel, who also created illustrations and etchings. Within 3 weeks of his return on the 2nd of September 1857, he read a preliminary account of his findings that he titled Preliminary Report on Recent Discoveries in Natural History on the Lower Murray. This account was given to the Philosophical Society at a complimentary dinner given by the Institute at the Criterion Hotel, where Blandowski received a standing ovation. Over the next couple of months, Blandowski prepared his report for publication and employed Frederick Gross and Nicolas Chevalier to create engraved plates from his field drawings of fish. However, again things began to go wrong. Blandowski attempted to emulate Ferdinand von Müller's success in naming floral genera after members of the Philosophical Institute, but the attempt badly backfired when the Reverend John Bleasdale and Richard Eads, the Mayor of Melbourne, took great exception to the descriptions of the fish attached to their names. So these two prominent council members felt insulted by the descriptions as follows. Sample N. Slimy, slippery fish, lives in the mud, is of a violent bluish colour on the belly. The whole upper surface is of a dirty olivish green colour with numerous irregular dark patches. Sample B, a fish easily recognised by its low forehead, big belly and sharp spine. It's not known if Blandowski's insults were intentional, but it certainly led to substantial acrimony within the council. The Society ordered it to be published with the omissions of the objectionable pages dealing with the 19 new species of fish that were named after prominent members of the council. But Blandowski refused, and he was quickly censured by the council. As a result, this effectively robbed Blandowski of priority in describing, naming and providing the first ecological information on some of the previously unknown freshwater fish species. The insulted parties attempted to have him expelled from the institute, but eventually withdrew themselves when they could not obtain the required 2/3 majority of votes. After this conflict, Blandowski lost much of his interest in the society, but as a member of its exploration committee, he attended meetings until March 1859. He participated in organising the Burke and Wills expedition and felt strongly that Victorians should be actively involved in exploring Australia. He was ordered 3 times by the Victorian government to return his specimens and manuscripts. Blandowski delivered some collections to the University Museum on the 24th of December 1857, but without invoices, lists or memoranda. In 1858, he again clashed with McCoy, and the Melbourne Press accused Blandowski of retaining specimens, journals and drawings for his own use. This incident, in which he received a public lampooning, destroyed Blandowski's standing with influential members of the Philosophical Institute and his superior, Surveyor General Andrew Clark. From March 1858, Blandowski continued to collect specimens of Victorian natural history and to employ skilled draftsmen to illustrate them. However, there was also a series of inquiries into his conduct, his failure to report back to the Surveyor General's department, and his refusal to surrender the materials from the Murray River expedition to the government. While Blandowski did receive some financial compensation for his expenses, his Australian career was effectively over. He was threatened with legal action. At this point, he left Melbourne aboard the Prussian barque Mathilde on the 17th of March 1859 via Java and arrived at Hamburg in October 1859. He went to Brunswick and Berlin, complaining about the shabby treatment he'd received in Australia. He returned to his native Silesia and published some scientific papers relating to Australia in 1860 and 1861 in the Proceedings of the Natural Science Societies of Dresden and Breslau. Back in Germany, Blandowski gave lectures about his Australian explorations to academic societies. He had his illustrations redrawn into a portfolio of plates by Gustav Mutzel and attempted to gain support for his publishing ambitions. He sent a copy of his portfolio of engraved and hand-coloured plates, Australia Terra Cognita, to the Governor of Victoria, Sir Henry Berkeley, with a letter from Gleiwitz stating he had 200 similar plates ready to publish and asked for assistance. With 142 images and different sections dealing with Indigenous culture, from economy, activities, initiation ceremonies, combat, sickness and death. Blandowski also attempted to use the booklet, The Opinion of Men of Science in London, of William von Blandowski's 10 years' labour in Australia, 1849 to 1859, to appeal for support for the larger project. His efforts were unsuccessful. In many cases, the final works were either taken from photographs, turned into etchings and then photographed again, or were original sketchings that became etchings. In all cases, the works were enhanced using the artistic conventions of the time. Blandowski paid for the artwork and produced the albumen photographic images, having failed to secure the patronage he desired, and he paid for its printing. It is not known exactly how many copies of this were produced, but only one complete copy has survived in the collections of the State Library in Berlin. There's an incomplete copy with prints only at the Haddon Library, Faculty of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of Cambridge. Only the pamphlet with Blandowski's annotations, minus the prints, was printed by Gustav Neumann in Gluwitz in 1862, which explains why only 2 copies of the album are known to exist. The author's copy in Berlin with texts and prints, and an incomplete copy with the prints only in the Haddon Library. His drawings were notable for their accuracy and artistic value. Largely unknown is his application of the newly invented technology of photography for scientific purposes, and this album, created as the author's copy after his return to Germany from Australia, contains Blandowski's album of photographic prints of drawings and engravings, although some are strictly speaking just photographs, and there is a copy of the Australia Terra Cognita today in the State Library of New South Wales in the Mitchell collection. This publication marked Blandowski's final effort as an Australian natural historian. Unfortunately, it failed and it nearly bankrupted him, and he gave up. He took up residence at his mother's home at Gluwitz, where he set up a photographic studio and offered his services to local clientele. His attempt to regain employment in the mining service was unsuccessful, and he also spent a short time as an elected representative on the town council. Some kind of mental instability saw him committed to the provincial mental asylum at Bonslow, which is now Boslowiec in Poland, in 1873, aged only 51, and he died there of obstruction of the bowels on the 18th of December 1878, aged 56. After his death, one of Blandowski's sisters, Clementine, offered his illustrations, collections and notebooks to the Royal Library in Berlin. They were received and catalogued in 1882, and a large portfolio of plates and sketches relating to Australian natural history were given to the Zoological Museum, which is now the Museum of Natural History in Berlin, but many were not seen by most people in Australia for over 100 years. His name has been commemorated in a genus of marine fish, Blandowskius, and of the Murray River perches, Blandowskilia. Assessments of Blandowski's scientific and artistic career in Australia have been mixed. He was ambitious, eccentric, stubborn, impulsive and quarrelsome, and his scientific integrity was sometimes questioned, but credit should be given to his capacity for hard work and devotion to the founding of national collections. Throughout his life, his ego and lack of interpersonal skills resulted in great disappointments and public scandals. His own accounts depict a conflicted and contradictory individual. This mixed legacy has resulted in Blandowski's contribution to natural history, art and anthropology remaining almost unknown in Australia due to most of his records going back with him to Germany in 1859. And a quote given about Blandowski: "He was quite outspoken even against the British colonial establishment, but he conscientiously collected a wide range of specimens, artefacts and scientific evidence that has become very important to our nation's history and anthropological records." There is a cairn on the site at Merbean's Chaffey Landing where Blandowski and Krefft established their camp from April to December in 1857, and the statement written on the Blandowski cairn says, "Aided by the Nyeri Nyeri people, who identified the area as Mondeleman, they assembled a large and significant collection of over 17,000 terrestrial and aquatic animals from the region." Blandowski also meticulously observed and recorded the daily life of the local Indigenous peoples. The Mildura Rural City Council and the Merbean District Historical Society erected the cairn in 2007, and after 150 years, William Blandowski finally received recognition as a significant pioneer in natural history collections and classification. And on the notes for the episode and on my Facebook post, I will put a link up to the collection that the British Museum have, which is amazing with the detail and the depictions of the Nyeri Nyeri people. So I hope you enjoyed the story on Blandowski, not a well-known person in Australian history. So I hope you learned something about him today.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.